Fairly obvious that that's the aerial view of the Astrodome. It's not a live picture, though. It's on videotape. As we continue our coverage of the 1992 Republican Convention from Houston, Texas. Alexander Cockburn in this morning's Houston Chronicle, they start off with an editorial that says damage control. As Houston opens, GOP is forced on the defensive. Do you think that's an accurate account of what you're seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's saying it. I think they're oversaying it probably, but that's the theme at the moment until they have something else to write about. Until they've got the threat of the bombing raids on Iraq to throw up and catch on their horns now for a while. But the columnists and the editorials have been writing about George Bush virtually being down and out in the run-up period.
What do you think the lead story is out of this place?
I think it's too early to say. It depends if Bush manages to make a decent speech. I'm not sure the press will bill it as a decent speech, even if it is a decent speech, because I do think it's true the press is by and large rather more pro-Clinton than pro-Bush at the moment. And so they'll probably say, it'll be a sort of compromise between saying he's completely out, which of course would make the election rather boring, or saying, I don't think they'll say he's made a major comeback, and I don't think the conditions would warrant it. I mean, the objective conditions for Bush and the Republicans aren't very good.
Malcolm S. Forbes Jr. The Houston Chronicle goes on to say the Republicans have been forced onto the defensive as they open their convention. It is exactly what they didn't need. This was to have been the week they went on the offensive, tearing into the Democrats and taking the case they want to make the country. What do you think of the editorial and yesterday's news events?
Well, I think that the key for the Republicans right in this convention is not so much to tear the Democrats apart, but to set an agenda for the second term. First of all, establish that the first term wasn't quite the disaster that the press has made it out to be, but second, give people a sense of where Mr. Bush wants to take the country in the next 4 years. This goes against what all the political consultants say, which is they say you have to go negative, you have to bash Clinton. That's not going to work this time. He's got to be more positive, and if he does, he'll come out of the convention with some of a bounce, but I think it's going to be a cumulative thing, and by Labor Day, mid-September, if he does that, he's going to be back in the race.
In your August 17th magazine, you have a big interview with Milton Friedman.
Right.
First, let me ask you, why did you pick Milton Friedman? What was the purpose?
We had interviewed him several years ago, and he had made some very astute observations about where the economy was going and how the political economy looked. So we wanted to go back to him and ask him if his optimism was still justified, what he thought of Mr. Bush, what he thought of the economy, and where we were going from here. He was less enthusiastic than he was a few years ago, but his optimism finally showed through at the last paragraph.
There's a sub-quote you use in here, the Bush presidency has been very close to disaster.
Those are Mr. Friedman's words, and in a sense, coming off of 1988, there is a real sense of disappointment. I think particularly the way Mr. Bush handled his breaking of the tax pledge in 1990. Other parts of his record on free trade, bringing down inflation, ending the Cold War, little things like that, he's got a really good record. And if you look at the details of some of the things he's done in environmentalism and other areas, he's done better than he's given credit for. But when you try to deal behind the doors as he likes to do, you don't get much public recognition for it. So the key thing in this time, he's got to come out with a real pledge, not a pledge, but something substantive on the tax side, such as indexing capital gains or something that's going to make people feel he's really going to move on the domestic front for the second term.
It's quite funny to watch all these Republicans here, and they say Bush didn't do this and didn't do that. I mean, Bush inherited Reagan. I mean, he inherited all the economic policies that Reagan did, which did work mostly for rich people for a period. And then you have to pay the penalty. And now that they're paying the penalty, everybody says that there was a magic button. I feel rather sorry for Bush, actually, that I don't like Bush very much, but I think he's incurring a lot of unjustified blame for what's happened to the economy. I mean, they had what Bob Bartley at the Wall Street Journal called, the 7 fat years, which is obviously when you do all the so-called supply-side stuff, and the rich got richer, as all the economic examinations show, and there's tremendous amount of spending, and celebrated in your fine magazine week after week with the executive salaries zooming up and all the rest of it. And now there is a price to pay. And I don't think Bush, middle term or long term, has a plan. They're not going to come out of this There it is. Not going to come out of this convention with a plan for the economy because they haven't got any remote form of plan that could produce much of a change in the near term. So when these conservatives say Bush betrayed the Reagan message, or they try and, it's like trying to reconstitute a thing that time has simply eroded. It's not going to be there. It's not going to happen.
Steve Forbes.
Well, the 1980s and even the early 1990s were far better than revisionists and Democrats would like to lead you to believe. Income groups in all parts of the economy went up. 20 million new jobs were created, including a record number of high-paying jobs. The economy's growth as a whole exceeded the entire size of the West German economy. It was an extraordinary period. The net wealth of the nation went up, and despite the increase in debts, the assets of the nation increased even faster. So it was a good record, and when we went away from the principles that made it possible, the creation of small businesses, lowering tax hurdles and lowering regulatory hurdles, you pay a price for it. We knew how to do it, and that is unleash people. Let them do it. It works.
Let me ask both of you before we go any farther to define yourself politically, if you can. Mr. Cockburn?
Oh, me? I'd be described as being on the left. I mean, you have to remember that in this country now, when you say, I mean, the other day I saw someone calling Al Gore an extreme leftist. I mean, Al Gore is an extreme centrist. So the whole terms of debate have got completely out of control. It's sort of artful, where if you tag a liberal as a leftist, you tag a leftist as a lunatic. So I would be on the left. I don't like Bush. I think his economic policies, if everybody in the world did so well in the 80s, as Mr. Forbes implies, why are so many people rather distressed now and rather gloomy? I mean, their memories must be extraordinarily short.
Not at all. When an economy goes down, people's memories get soured. That's
You know perfectly well that every examination shows that in real terms, real working class wages.
That is preposterous. Working wages went up. The average person who went into the workforce in 1982
Let
was
me finish
50%
my sentence.
higher
The
in
real wages for working people peaked in 1973. As far as politically, so I was saying Bush is on the right, and I think Clinton is a centrist, heavily oriented towards business. And there, I think, that in the country, and not very well represented in the media, there is a left, of which I'm a part.
Before we go to Mr. Forbes, you live where?
Northern California, Humboldt County, home of the Redwoods.
And you're a citizen of what country?
Ireland.
Where were you born?
Scotland.
And when you say you're a man of the left, what does that mean? Give me 2 or 3 things you would change immediately if you were president of the United States.
That I'd change immediately?
Yeah, to show us where you're coming from.
I think the entire weight and direction of economic policy in this country favors corporations, favors the rich. I think it tends to penalize the poor. I think the trade policies of this country tend to impact very grievously on the third world. I think, environmentally speaking, a lot of environmental policies grievously impact working people. I'd be in favor of labor unions. I think the rights of working people in this country have been grievously trashed in the last decade. If you're looking at worksite injury, places like that. I think the entire political economy of this country and the last generation have been oriented towards property, towards the corporate, towards the haves, and against the have-nots, against the lower regions of society. That's basically the take of the leftists, I suppose. And
you, Mr. Forbes, politically, would you you have a party label you put on yourself?
Well, I usually vote Republican, but I'm pro-growth, pro-individual, pro-opportunity. And that means doing things like lowering the capital gains tax, which creates opportunities for small starting businesses to compete against the big companies. When you have an environment that is very heavily regulated, very heavily taxed, you make it good for the big companies because they have all the assets to cope with that. It's the small business people that are hurt. Between 82 and 86, 14 million new jobs are created by new businesses. That's where the innovation comes from. That's where the spur of the economy comes from. That's what we need to get an environment to let that grow again.
Would you be on the right or in the center, or how would you define your position in the Republican Party?
Well, I think today it's rather ironic, shows how labels change over time, that conservatives are more open, pro-opportunity. 60 years ago, conservatives in this country were protectionists. They were anti-Roosevelt, they were anti-pensions, anti-everything, anti-world, anti-interventionist. And today it's the conservatives are the ones who are free trade, who are for opportunity, lower taxes, getting the individual back in the mainstream. And it's the Democrats who have become what the Hooverites were in the 1930s.
Your magazine sells to how many people a week?
We have a circulation of about 750,000 subscribers.
You were born where?
In New Jersey.
And where do you live now?
It's still in New Jersey. Didn't move very far, unlike Mr. Cockburn.
We're going to the phones in about 20 minutes, but for the time being, let's look at the Houston Post this morning. Bush, Cheney denied politically based Iraq plans, and there you get the big banner here, showtime for GOP and city. Party has big selling job ahead. Let me just ask both of you about this story from yesterday, and this is written by Kirk Spitzer, Gannett News Service, Dateline, Washington. President Bush and Defense Secretary Dick Cheney angrily denied a report Sunday that U.S. and allied leaders plan to provoke a military confrontation with Iraq to bolster Bush's foundering presidential campaign. How does a story like this start? Do you have any idea?
Well, the story started yesterday with a report by Patrick Tyler in the New York Times.
But how does that start?
Well, my view would be, looking at that story, was that a story like that is clearly leaked. I mean, it was the story, as much as said, that a leak being when someone, you know, goes to the reporter privately and says, here, what we think is going to happen. The question was this a leak from the administration alerting the readers of the New York Times to the plans of Bush people in a friendly way, or was it a preemptive strike which would be such as to annoy Bush about a leak? Well, it seems to have been the latter, that it seems to have been the work of someone who wasn't necessarily in favor of this bombing of Iraq to coincide with the Republican convention. And that, because Bush himself, although he sort of confirmed the story, seemed to be very angered yesterday when he talked about it to reporters from the White House.
One small thing, maybe not so small, the dateline on the story, Patrick Tyler's story, was Houston. Can we infer from that somebody out of Houston leaked this story to Patrick Tyler?
Not necessarily. It was clearly done, as I think, as Mr. Cockburn points out, to designed to embarrass the Bush administration, designed to stop what looked like might happen. Put the president on the defensive, saying he isn't doing it just because of politics. But of course that all boils down to what happened back after the Gulf War, which was that they should have marched on Baghdad and got rid of the guy a year and a half ago. He's like one of these monsters that keep rising up. Hollywood will have a lot of fun with him. You'll do Saddam 13, Saddam 14. The time to have done it was a year and a half ago. But better late than never with these little Hitlers.
Oh, I think, I think the idea that it's an easy thing for supposing Bush, well, they've got to inspect the ministry. I mean, the scenario is that they inspect the ministry, the Iraqis deny them access, and then after a period, the planes take off from the aircraft carrier with the smart missile. They make a tremendous bang, which is, I suppose, photographed by some team from the Rashid Hotel. This is then transmitted to the viewers in America, who are so pleased with the exhibition of military might that they all vote Republican in the fall, which I think is a pretty childish scenario. For one thing, there's nobody in the ministries. They've long since vacated them, so it's very symbolic. Secondly, it could be very much in Saddam's interests. He could say, well, you've blown up this empty building, here I am, now I'm going to take my army and I'm going to move into Kurdistan. And I'm going to surround a Kurd city, and what are you going to do about that, Mr. Bush? And then, what is Bush going to do then? Everything he does with Iraq, unless Saddam is dead, reminds people that he didn't kill Saddam 18 months ago. So I don't think, if they may be annoyed that it was leaked yesterday, but certainly it's in their mind that a military confrontation before November mightn't do them any harm. But I think Iraq is a lot more difficult than might be easily imagined. It's not so easy.
Mr. Forbes, on a lighter note, maybe, depending on how you look at it, do you think the president knew when he posed for this picture that with the dog, that the cover copy would say Dog Days? What went wrong? Well,
presidents always should know that when you pose with a dog, you're going to get in trouble. Herbert Hoover did one in 1932, feeding the dog meat during the midst of the Depression, which Democrats made good fun of. Lyndon Johnson got in trouble when he went a little far with his dogs. So unless it's Mrs. Bush, when you pose with the dogs, you open yourself up for it. So it's inevitable.
My little dog Fowler. What about Roosevelt? Fowler did Roosevelt fine.
Roosevelt knew how to play politics better than anyone else in this century.
This picture was taken by Michael O'Neill. Sounds like an Irishman to me. How long have you lived in this country?
20 years.
And why do you maintain your Irish citizenship? Why didn't you become an American? It's not meant as criticism, I just was interested.
What? Well, I suppose it's one of those things you say, well, I'll do that tomorrow. I think after 20 years it's actually a pretty simple business, but not a little sentimentality about the old.
Citizen when you were born in Scotland?
Oh, well, my mother is Irish, my father was Scottish, and then I grew up in Ireland, and then I had the choice between being Irish or being Scottish. And when I went to school in Scotland, I was regularly beaten up by my schoolmates because they believed their parents told them that Ireland was neutral in the war, which in fact it was. But of course I remembered I was beaten up every day by these little wretches, so I naturally went the other way and became an Irish citizen.
Who are the other Cockburns?
Well, I have a brother right here in Houston, Patrick, who has actually worked for the Independent and was in Baghdad for much of the war at the Rashid Hotel, the bombing. In fact, he was who told me that the ministries now, he just shifted his assignment from the Middle East to Washington. But he recently was in Baghdad and saw these ministries and saw that, in fact, these places they're intending to bomb have been mostly vacated. And then I have another brother, I believe, has been on your on this program called Andrew, who with his wife Leslie has written a number of books, Dangerous Liaisons, which is recently about the relationship between the U.S. and Israel.
Mr. Forbes, you're Malcolm S. Forbes Jr. Your father was the senior, obviously. How long has he been dead?
A little 2.5 years.
And did you take over the magazine, or did you have the responsibility for the magazine before his death?
I had a lot of responsibilities for his death. One of the remarkable aspects of his character is that he was able and willing during his lifetime, despite being a very strong individual, to share more and more responsibilities with me and my brother. So the transition went smoother than it did in most companies that go through such a change. And I have 3 brothers in the business, and we get along very well, primarily because I own more stock than they do.
How old are they?
They're younger than I am, so I believe in primogeniture, unlike most Americans. I think Mr. Jefferson was wrong on that one. But we all believe, as my father liked to say, there's nothing wrong with nepotism as long as you keep it within the family.
How big is Forbes, the company?
It's fair-sized. One of the advantages of being privately held is we don't have to reveal the numbers, so that we make it harder for people to do to us what we routinely do to others. That is poking their business.
What do you own besides the magazine?
We have a number of weekly newspapers in New Jersey. We have American Heritage magazine. We have a number of supplements, such as FYI, which is a lifestyle supplement. And we have an unusual so-called high-tech magazine called ASAP, which is coming out at year-end. And we have some land businesses as well. But the magazine, Forbes magazine, is the heart of the company.
And if people want to read you these days, where can they find you?
Well, in The Nation magazine, which is the leading sort of liberal weekly in the country, sells about 100,000. And I have a column in there every other week. Then I have a column which is syndicated to a number of papers. It appears in the Los Angeles Times every week, San Francisco Examiner, a number of their other papers.
You used to have a piece once in a while in the Wall Street Journal. What happened to that?
I had a piece every 3. I was part of a panel that, which was the on the editorial page of the Journal, which is pages which are, you know, fairly conservative, as we might imagine. They allowed every week to even the score a kind of little liberal window. And for 10 years I did that, alternating with Hodding Carter and at the end Mike Gardner. And I think they just thought, well, we'd had our turn at bat, and they opened it up to other people. Every now and again I do one.
In this morning's Newsweek, Peggy Noonan has a memo to the president. Peggy Noonan, who wrote a number of speeches for President Bush, also President Reagan. And this is about the speech on Thursday night here. She says it's a time to get serious, and has a lot of advice in here for the president. And let's see, including, war talk. In private, you speak of Desert Storm with humility and quiet pride. On the stump, your references take on a kind of agitated boastfulness. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it simply boils down to Mr. Bush's problems. One of his major problems is he's not a so-called good communicator the way his predecessor was. Personably, he's a very personable man, a person who has great charm, a person who really attracts people to him, engenders great loyalty. And I think that if he tried to just do that in public, what he does so effectively in private, he will do much better in the campaign than those who say he's got to screech and go negative. It hurts him more than helps him.
Let me read more of Peggy Noonan here in her memo to the president. You're normal. By the way, what do you think of a former employee writing a memo to the president in a magazine?
Oh, I think Peggy Noonan's terribly silly. I've always thought she was the person who wrote, she gave Reagan the phrase about the Contras, that they represented the ideals of the founding fathers, which was, I suppose, one of the, from the point of view of a speechwriter trying to make an argument for intervention against Cuba, which I don't, Nicaragua, I don't agree with. It was one of the most sort of stupid remarks I've ever written. And I think she's a terrible self-advertiser, and I think that kind of stuff it's not worth reading, really.
I'd take the opposite stand. She's a superb writer, has wonderful insights, almost Reagan-esque insights, which I take as a compliment, not a detriment. And what's wrong with sharing those views in public? Everyone else does, and she's got a good audience, and if he reads it, that's all of the good, but the key is to get also the people around him to realize they've got to change gears publicly.
Let me read a little more. She says, your normal approach to things is low-key, modest, often wry, but your advisors tell you to show how you feel when you make a speech, and you act how you feel, and sometimes it doesn't work because you're not an actor. As a former advisor, I feel free to say, kill the advisors. So far?
Well, people always say that, kill the advisors. It goes on. I remember the very first time I ever wrote about Bush, which is, you know, when he was running against Reagan, and I remember he does, when he makes these speeches, he sort of hops about. I remember describing him as Janis Joplin in pinstripe, and he sort of works himself up in a way that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. He makes I never thought Reagan was a particularly great communicator. I think the press hypnotized themselves about Reagan, and they'll probably do it again tomorrow, the return of the old magician and the rest of it, when he speaks tonight here in Houston. But as for this stuff about shoot the advisors, it's a sort of recurring theme in this kind of Washington journalism. That, you know, when things seem to be going badly, you line them all up against the wall, whether it's Sununu. Well, I remember the press were after Sununu, and they finally nailed Sununu, and then they got this, what's his name, the chap who came in as after him. I can't remember his name now.
Sam Skinner?
Skinner. Now then the Skinner's, of course, doesn't do very well, and then they bring the next fellow in. It'll be Baker, and Baker's going to be, and Baker may not do very well, and I don't know what they'll do then. It'll be all over by that time. But it's a sort of industry in Washington. Most of it is pretty unconvincing.
She also talks earlier in this piece about the journalists and what they think of Mr. Clinton and Mr. Bush. Some of this language is a little strong, but I'll read it anyway. And his friends, the newspaper poets, back there tapping in the back of the plane, and every time they see Clinton, their eyes shine because what they're really seeing is, and then it's in italics, the house in McLean and the phone call in the night, the journal entry, the president called again tonight. I know why he was up alone, Sarajevo again. Butt heads with laptops, going for the Bradley Cup, obviously meaning Ben Bradley. That's what you think of them in your less charitable moods, she's saying to the president. Well, stay less charitable for a minute.
I think it's true. I mean, a lot of these journalists are dying for Clinton to be president and are very sycophantic. I think actually what Ms. Noonan says is correct on that case. I think there's a whole slew of journalists out there. I'm thinking people like Sid Blumenthal, who's a huge Clinton groupie, who feel they've been excluded at a career level from that moment when you get translated from being a sort of the chap on the outside to being inside, and they're very hungry. And I think the press have been much more forgiving of Clinton than they have of Bush.
Clinton works very hard with the press. That's why long before the nomination process really got underway in the public's eye, you started seeing all of these cover stories about Bill Clinton. He established himself as a front runner. He's a so-called policy wonk, talks their language, brings them in, speaks to them as if they're one-on-one, as if he's sharing thoughts with them, trying to get their thoughts. And it can be very seductive. Kennedy did it very well. Lyndon Johnson did it poorly. In Britain, Harold Wilson, a fellow no one even remembers these days, in the 60s, got a lot of good press by doing that. Then the relationship soured. But Bush does not get along with reporters. Clinton does very well, and that's one reason why he survived despite all the adversities that normally would knock a candidate out in this country.
You have a little piece in your, by the way, you write a column every week?
Every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks?
We come out every 2 weeks.
That's why we have an August 17th edition here. What's it dated to?
2 weeks, right.
So we won't have another Forbes until next Monday.
Well, you have one coming out this week. The new issue will be coming out this week.
What day does it hit the newsstands?
It'll hit the newsstands on Wednesday.
Of this week. So is it already printed somewhere?
It's going out in the trucks right now as we speak.
And in this, and you have a column called Fact and Comment every week.
That's right.
Do you write it yourself?
That's right. No, as my father used to say when people would ask him that, no one else could write such guff. So the editors are always reassure people that they have no responsibility for what's in there.
And you have here a thing, dump quail, question mark, rather than me read it. What was your point here?
Rather than dump quail, dump the policies that got him in trouble, primarily that 1990 budget agreement, which ended up raising taxes and ended up increasing spending more than it should have otherwise. Mr. Quayle has also been very good at coming up with good reforms, whether it's of the legal system, on the education side. So he's been politically street smart, much better than the press gives him credit for.
What do you think of Mr. Quayle?
Oh, I don't think very highly of Mr. Quayle. I think, I mean, all you can take what Mr. Forbes says and turn it upside down, you'll pretty much get my view. I think Quayle's view of regulation is primitive in the extreme. I mean, the fact of the matter is that you cannot, in the late 20th century, think that all environmental regulation is a disastrous inhibition on business. It's really a bit late to take that position, which has been generally a Quayle position.
By the way, have you two ever met each other before?
No.
I don't believe so.
Do you think it's safe to assume, as differences in point of view go, that you couldn't be more opposite than you two?
I don't know. There may be unexpected points of contact. I have many dear conservative friends, some of views I agree with. I was rather positive on the flat tax when I was rather a keen supporter of Jerry Brown earlier this year, and he came out with a flat tax, which I think needed a bit of work. But actually, I read a piece in the Wall Street Journal saying that the left should get behind it, because it was a thing that people could understand. A lot of conservatives were astounded and welcomed me with open arms. So, you know, there are moments of paradox here.
That's one of them. I was a great flat tax supporter. As Mr. Cockburn says, part of Jerry Brown's plan needed a lot of work, but the concept is irrefutable, and after 80-some-odd years of 40,000 pages of tax code that has corrupted the system and distorted the economy in all sorts of ways, it would be good just to junk it and start it off at once. You could almost do it in 40 pages to help out the accountants and lawyers. You'd probably do it 400 pages so they have something to do each day. But it would be wonderful, all that intellectual energy going into something productive rather than trying to cope with this monster that doesn't do anyone any good, or most people any good.
It's about 26 minutes after 7 in Houston. That makes it an hour behind the East Coast. We'll go to the phones in 4 minutes. Mr. Cockburn in Forbes magazine, August 17th, Mr. Forbes writes, pundits and politicos are proffering Perot's pusillanimous pullout as proof positive that there is a lot more to politics than outsiders appreciate. As one reporter put it, politics is a profession, not for these amateurs that say, I've got a lot of money. True enough, but it is too bad that these same people don't have a similar appreciation of what it takes to start and to run a successful business. Otherwise, they wouldn't keep coming up with growth-destroying tax and regulatory policies. Education is a two-way street.
Are you going to comment on the alliteration at the beginning?
No.
Or the views at the end? I kind of got lost in the sentence. The idea being that people don't understand that
business. They don't give credit
to
business for what it does.
Well, business people particularly have said that for a long time. I guess business, and you could say that people who dig ditches feel that people who don't dig ditches don't realize the tremendous tedium and strength required to dig a ditch. I mean, people always want their trumpet to be tooted a bit more. Business has been whining away for as long as I can remember, as long as anybody can remember, that it's vilely treated and, you know, crippled by regulation, suffocated by the cushions of rules, and, you know, can hardly move a muscle. And most of it's absolute nonsense. Business has a very, very good time of it in this country, and Mr. Forbes has done rather well, I think, in recent years, Forbes magazine, although, as he says, the numbers aren't available for scrutiny, but he doesn't seem to be emaciated and thin, and I think has probably done not too badly, as most businessmen have. And we could get into the subject of executive compensation. I mean, a lot of these businessmen who are roaring away about the dreadful impediments to free enterprise, you know, are on staggering rates of salary. I'm talking, of course, mostly about the big corporate chieftains at a level proportionate to the wages earned by their workers, which is tremendously different from the rest of the world. And I think people here know it, and they think, you know, some person on the line working away that sees someone at the top of the company earning, you know, millions. I mean, millions and millions every year, and with a great golden parachute strapped on his back and the rest of it, and they think there's something out of whack here. As for regulation, business crippled by regulation, it's ludicrous. They're not crippled by regulation. There's been a straight run down since the early 70s, since Nixon founded, let's take EPA and OSHA, which are two agencies, occupational safety and health, and environmental protection. On occupational safety and health, I think there's been one conviction in 22 years for a breach by an employer. One. This is scarcely an advertisement for big government getting on at people's back.
We've got a call waiting, but I want Mr. Forbes to have a comment here.
Well, in the 1970s, regulation was on a real rip, and OSHA was always going into the workplaces and measuring toilet seats and things like that. In the 80s, it got a little more sensible. We do live in a complex world, so you need rules and regulations, but you can have sensible ones and you can have destructive ones. When you have destructive ones, you get less economic growth, and everyone suffers from that. In terms of regulation in the last couple of years, it has gone on a rip again. It is much harder to get a bank loan because of regulation today. Environmental rules are becoming much more complex and destructive.
Regulation of banks. I mean, the savings and loan crisis cost the taxpayer billions and billions of dollars because there was no regulation. You've got to have regulation, otherwise what happened? Business stole all the money.
Well, and on the banking side, you didn't have a
You're about
real
to have
free
another
market.
banking crisis too.
You didn't have a real free market forces, but you had an overreaction, especially on the capital side. It's one thing to have regulation, but not another to say banks you can't lend to customers. That's destructive.
Time to go to the phones. Birmingham, Alabama. You're our first caller of the morning. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Morning.
Really do appreciate C-SPAN and everything that you've done for us viewers out here.
Thank you.
I have two questions. The first one's kind of short. He mentioned Al Gore earlier and said he was a centrist. It's my understanding that Al Gore has the same voting record as Ted Kennedy, and I wonder if he would consider Ted Kennedy a centrist. Number two...
hold on just a second. Let me ask Mr. Cockburn. Is Mr. Kennedy a centrist?
Oh, yes, I think so. The media, again, love to call Kennedy the hero of the old liberals. I mean, Kennedy actually talk about deregulation, which Mr. Forbes, I guess, is I don't know where your position is, Brian, but in this room, the main advocate of business and deregulation. Kennedy led the charge on deregulation in the late 70s on the airlines. To take a recent episode, Kennedy voted when the rail workers, the Congress voted to stop the rail lockout. Kennedy voted to suspend the strike, which was a very anti-labor move. There's a lot of myth-making about what a liberal is in Congress.
Follow-up, Birmingham.
Well, we need fellows like him to put our views in perspective. I appreciate his being there. My second question is a matter of timing, and it seems that the Democrats have been pretty handy at picking up a handful of mud, screaming that the Republicans are going to throw it, and then as the press turns on the Republicans, the Democrats sling that handful of mud. My question is, do you think that Baker will be better able to perceive this sense of timing and do a better job of handling a response to this kind of an approach by the Democrats?
Thanks.
And that's it. I'll hang up and listen.
Thanks for calling, Mr. Forbes.
Well, I don't think, to answer your first question, that Teddy is a centrist. He's for national health care. He's never found a tax rise that he didn't like. So he's on the liberal side of American politics. As for the other part of your question, which was referring to what? Birmingham?
Birmingham is not there.
Okay.
He wanted to know about Jim Baker and whether or not
Jim Baker will be much better in terms of responding less clumsy, less sophomoric in terms of those attacks. The Democrats really have had it both ways. When the Republicans said, gee, we might have a test on abortion for Supreme Court nominees, everyone said this is outrageous. When Clinton said that he would have one that would be pro-choice, nobody said boo. There is a double standard on that, and I think Mr. Baker will be more adept at pointing that out.
Red Banks, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Hi.
Mr. Cockburn, you're my type of guy. Mr. Forbes, you are not. First of all, thanks to C-SPAN, I had the opportunity to watch Mr. Bush's acceptance speech in 1988. If that isn't a deterrent to vote for him, I don't know what could be.
Give us specifics.
Just absolutely everything that he said did not come to pass, not to mention the lies. He stated that he would not be pressured by Congress to go against raising taxes, but as we all know, indeed he was. If I had my way, Ross Perot would be president, William Grider would be vice president, and Brian Lamb would be Secretary of State.
Thanks for the call. Let me ask you, because she said, and I know she didn't mean to do this, but she said Mr. Cockburn, and it's Coburn. But why do people? Why is the difference pronunciation between what you get in Great Britain and what
that
you
was
get
the
here?
decision made by some Scots Coburn in the 16th century, or whenever, I don't know. It came out as Coburn, and some people, I guess, change it right the way through, like the late Charles Coburn, and others don't.
And do you get a lot of that here in this country, the Cockburn?
Not really. In England, it used to be good because there's a port wine called Coburn's Port. And the company used to have little advertisements, you know, instructing people humorously how to pronounce it. So a lot of people in England used to know that. But yeah, it seems to be, I survive. It's not one of the worst things I've done. Yeah.
And other than the Secretary of State suggestion she had, how about the...
I can see that you're already rehearsing your nomination speech.
Yeah. Mr. Perot, both of you comment, please, on him.
Oh, Perot. And she said, let's not admit Bill Grider, who is a good writer who writes now for Rolling Stone, has written a good, interesting book about the lack of democracy in this country, I think, called what? Who Will Tell the People, I think it's called. Good book, which is the person she mentioned as well. Perot, I mean, I think Perot started with there's always this idea for the person who's going to come from outside the normal bounds of politics, and Perot appealed to that. People have this, you know, slight yearning for the white horse. The chap on the white horse is going to solve everything. And it's a measure of their frustration. I think the major feature of this year is tremendous frustration that the system isn't working correctly, and the rest of it. I think Perot was largely full of hot air, and I think his economic program was terrible.
I would agree that his economic program was terrible, and I think that's why he probably withdrew before he unveiled it, because he would have almost had to withdraw when his standing in the polls plummeted when it came out. It was simply a lot of tax rises, a lot of trying to cap entitlements, and sort of what you might call trench warfare economics. Not going to work, not going to get real economic growth and solve the problems of this country. And politically, though, he's part of a tradition in this country, and people are frustrated. They do go to the outside. They went from Andrew Jackson to Grover Cleveland. Woodrow Wilson was a college president, 1 year as governor and president of the United States. Jimmy Carter was part of that. Reagan was part of that. So he's part of that tradition. Unfortunately, he didn't have the stamina to withstand the heat.
You are still a trustee at Princeton, where Mr. Wilson was the president?
That's right. But he had the same troubles there that he had with the nation in terms of his political abilities and inabilities.
By the way, those that follow this stuff, we had George W. Bush, the president's son, on yesterday, and his comments about Ed Rollins made this morning's Houston Post, and here's what the story looks like right here. As a matter of fact, it says Rollins unlikely to rejoin Bush's campaign team. In the piece itself, they write to begin, and they say, in the When Pigs Fly department comes this little question from the Republican National Convention: could Ed Rollins be back on the White House campaign team? And it says, not if George W. Bush, President Bush's son and political advisor, has anything to say about it. And he made some comments here yesterday, those of you who saw the interview, along those lines. Seattle, Washington, thank you for waiting. Go ahead, please.
Yes, gentlemen, I'd like a two-part. If I could, I'd like to address both Mr. Forbes and Mr. Cockburn. In the case of Mr. Forbes, I'm originally Princeton class of '77, and way back when, I spent probably the bulk of my career at the university at the Princeton Inn College. At the time, when the college's name was changed to Forbes College, I thought it was a little bit of an ego trip, if you will. But after hearing you speak tonight with, you know, as articulate and lucid as you've been, I'm well gratified that my former residential college wears your family name.
I hope my kids are listening.
In the second case, I'd like to address Mr. Cockburn. I read a while back a little piece in the Wall Street Journal, which you frequently write for, about an interview that was done with Mr. McGovern, who apparently, after having had a route running, I believe, a resort in Connecticut, was interviewed and made several comments. Among them, he said that knowing what he knows now after having engaged in the business for the first time in his life, that he well understands how the small businessman panicked at the thought of his having taken the presidency in '72. And he also mentioned the fact that he now believes that no one who has never had to meet a payroll should engage in politics. Let me ask you a question, Mr. Cockburn. Have you ever had to meet a payroll?
Yeah, I meet a payroll, very small payroll, but I meet one. I have a couple of people I pay on a regular basis, and I'm concerned about it. So The Wall Street Journal loves that quote from McGovern. I think they've used it about 100 times. And McGovern must have known what he was doing when he said it. Well, sure, yes, if you run a business, you do have concerns and responsibilities. And, and it's probably a good thing that people... And if people, by the same token, had to work as, let's say, let's say, the upper class, the privileged class, they had to work as a hospital orderly for 6 months, or, you know, as a common day laborer for 6 months, maybe they also would have their perspective changed. It works both ways.
By the way, on the front...
As a matter of fact, a good company, I think it was Hyatt, one of the major hotel companies, each year makes their top people work as hotel workers, whether it's a doorman, check-in person, or something like that. It's a good perspective to get down in the trenches once in a while, selling or whatever.
Let me show our audience the front page of the Wall Street Journal, which has a piece right here by John Harwood. And the headline on this is, "To win George Bush," and I can't read it. It's not close enough.
Let's finally identify a vision of himself.
Thank you. I'm reading it, trying to read it backwards. As a matter of fact, please give me that shot again so we can get the subhead. As his pragmatic side, I can't see it.
As his pragmatic side wars with warmer instincts, President appears adrift. He is
three or four different people. Either one of you agree with that?
Well, that's one of those silly headlines that then they go after George Bush. And I mean, I don't know. George Bush seems to me to be a fairly clearly a single individual. I don't see 3 or 4 heads protruding from the top of his shirt. They always say at war with himself. He doesn't seem to be at war with himself. I think it's nonsense.
Well, I think what that really boils down to is the problem he has communicating in politics. He does not like campaigning. He does not like doing public policy speeches, as his predecessor did so well. It's not his instinct, and he's uncomfortable doing it. So when they try to get him to do what he doesn't like to do, he doesn't often do it well. I think that if he tries to be a little more natural, talk to on TV or elsewhere, the way he talks to individuals in a small setting, he'd be far more effective. And I think that's something about his advisors, is that they try to make him what he isn't. Instead of playing to his strengths, they always try to make you what you aren't. And that's part of the problem Perot had with Mr. Rollins. That's part of the problem all of these people have, is they get distorted in ways that the public perceive as false.
We have a camera outside showing some of the activity. The president's expected to be here, I believe, later today. There's some construction going on. Greenville, South Carolina. Thanks for waiting.
Yeah, I got 2 things to say on the economy and one on regulation, particularly to the guy on the left. First of all, Clinton says he's going to raise taxes on the rich. Taxing the top 2% of the rich is the same thing as taxing everybody. We saw that with the luxury tax. A good example is like this. Look, if a millionaire spends $1 million on a $1 million house built by 20 carpenters and each carpenter gets $50,000, okay? Now, if the government taxes a millionaire by 38%, all other things being equal, each carpenter only gets $31,000. You see, the rich have less money to spend on the middle class. You see, the money market is like a big lake, and we all swim in it, and it doesn't matter where you pull the money, where you pull the water out of the lake, and then we all have less water to swim in. Incidentally, poor people swim too. See, so the Democrats think they can pull money out of nowhere. We saw what happened with the luxury tax. Thousands of people were unemployed. Now to the guy on the left, as far as regulation concerned, the consumer is often named as the beneficiary of such regulation. Yet a mounting body of statistical evidence has shown quite dramatically that much regulation has simply been used to benefit firms already in the industry. Indeed, the demand for regulation usually comes not from consumer groups, but rather from special interest groups within an industry. This is coming right out of my economics book, you know? So it's not like I'm making this up.
All right, thanks, caller. Mr. Cockburn.
Well, on the first statement, I think he was saying that if you tax the millionaire, then you don't get trickle-down. But you can have redistribution. On his thesis, you give all the money to the millionaire and he builds an enormous house and all the carpenters get work. But you could do it another way, that he can't build quite such a big house, but the carpenters have more money in the first place. I mean, it's just a matter of how you do the redistribution. On the second question on regulation, yes, he's quite right. A lot of regulation is written by industry. I mean, for example, in food, you had, let's say, some years ago, little people producing, let's say, ham, Virginia ham, and in the little farm or whatever, and then along comes the big business, and they get the regulator to say you've got to have a ham boiling machine which costs $250,000 to install. Buy the small business, and the big business gets the monopoly of ham production. I mean, everybody knows that. It's quite true. That doesn't invalidate regulation. I mean, you could, a lot of regulation is, or some of it is fairly beneficial. Once, of course, the regulating agency is completely captured by business or by whatever, then it ceases to be particularly effective.
Well, it is true about regulation sometimes designing in a way that ends up hurting the consumer than helping it. There was a TV story the other day about in Washington, D.C., where a beautician does hair in a certain way that his competitors don't like, and so they're trying to run him out of business because he hasn't spent umpty-dumpty years and hours learning how to do things that no one wants to do 30 years ago. So that happens all the time, and that's why when you get some of these regulatory binges, they're designed to do things other than help the consumer. They're designed to advance political agendas, which have nothing to do with really helping the consumer. So on that, and on the tax side, it's not trickle down or trickle up. It's having rates that enable people to get out there, create capital, create new businesses. And high rates are destructive. Every time a country has a tax rising binge, it goes down in economic growth. Taxes are not only a means of raising revenue, they're also a price. And if the price on good things is too high, you get less of it.
If you're watching this live in about 2 hours and 15 minutes, the Republican convention actually gavels in. Medill, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was wondering, the Federal Reserve, the standard of gold seems to be kind of eliminated nowadays. It just represents a bunch of numbers representing debt, and it seems that the world society has just converted over to recognizing this. And I personally, I'm a 25-year-old, and I've never voted, and watching the banking scandals and all these other things happening in the world and history shows that it's been kind of corrupt, you know. Why should I be voting here?
Thanks. Mr. Forbes, you want to start?
Well, if you have a candidate who's pro-economic growth, then you should vote because that's the way to get the economy moving again. If you're not involved, nothing good is going to happen. I think we found that out many times in the past. As for the Federal Reserve, we have been off of any kind of gold standard for more than 20 years. That's why we got the great inflation of the 1970s. That's why we had the painful readjustments in many parts of the economy in the 80s and early 90s. If we got some sort of sound monetary system, you would see interest rates even go lower than they are today. Imagine getting 6% mortgage or the government borrowing at 4% instead of 7 or 8%. Everyone would come out ahead.
I think on this, as for voting, I mean, one of the important things about voting is not so much the top of the tree. You could say, actually, between Clinton and Bush, maybe if you really sat down, you'd say far less is going to happen by way of division than people now suppose. But obviously, when you vote, there's a tremendous number of other, much lower races going on and initiatives at the local level, and these are very important. The nearer you get to, you know, to the community, the town, very often the more significant that one's vote is. As for banking, I mean, one of the things that's not being talked about much is the likelihood of an enormous commercial bank crisis, just like the savings and loan crisis that happened. People aren't talking much about that.
Here's what this morning's USA Today front page looks like, with an emphasis on the story that most papers have on their front page, and a shot of an aircraft carrier over in that part of the world. San Diego, next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Brian.
Morning.
Biggest fan of C-SPAN. I think it's done more good for the American voter than anything that's ever been created.
Thank you.
My two comments are, one, Mr. Perot, I agree with the caller that you had on yesterday that said that, I don't know, something about, she thought that he was used by the Democrats and that his pulling out at that time with the comment that, well, now that the Democrats have their act together, I think I'll just bow out.
You know, we had a couple of weeks ago people who thought it was the other way around, that he was used by the Republicans and used by the Democrats. Do you really think either party used him and did it overtly and talked back and forth and made some kind of a decision to have an impact on this election?
Well, I'll tell you why, my opinion, why I think he was used. I think he was used in the sense that, well, I know that this is part of his personality, not wanting to be roped in or be told what to do, that he always has to run everything, the little Napoleon complex. But I think that this sneaking off and his aides and everyone never knew where he was going. He never really made any policy statements except ones that, if you really look at them, really coincided with a lot of stuff that Bill Clinton and the Democrats were for. Never really come out with real basic policy standards or statements.
Okay, thanks. Do either one of you think that Mr. Perot was a part of either party's
Not at all. He was part of himself and wasn't able to adjust to the political environment, especially getting hammered by the press each day. That's what really did him in. He couldn't stand it, couldn't turn it off, and wanted to get away from it.
Do you know him, by the way?
I've met him a few times, and I must say I was surprised at how quickly he withdrew. It was no surprise that he wouldn't take well the hammering that he was going to get, and so I thought he would have faded in September rather than in July.
Some people think he'll be back before this is over.
I don't know. I don't know why he backed out. Maybe he didn't have so much money. You know, everyone always said he was a billionaire, and maybe he just... I mean, it suddenly realized it was going to cost him $100 million, and he thought, I've only got $500 million or $1 billion, and, you know, I won't be able to go out and get dog food. I don't know. Maybe that's the way he felt. To me, it's slightly inexplicable that he sort of threw it all in like that.
Buffalo, New York. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Brian. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Brian, I want to commend C-SPAN specifically for the objectivity of its moderators. You people really are the best.
Thank you very much, sir.
Yes, Mr. Forbes, thank you very much for trumpeting my feelings, my views. Why is it always questioned or talked about when it comes to this no new taxes pledge with George Bush that all he was doing was trying to get along with Congress, passing congressional ideas along, thinking that he can possibly get along. Now they're slamming him every single day in the polls. We get a little mudslinging coming from George Bush, and or not so much George Bush, but from his campaign, and it's back away. It's not fair. Also, I'd like to say one more thing. I just like his response. Why isn't it trumpeted enough about the fact that Bush did acquiesce to the Congress?
Thanks.
Well, he made the mistake in going along with Congress in terms of raising taxes. It wasn't a major tax increase, but it was destructive enough going into a recession. I think that he likes to try to work with Congress rather than going against it, especially as it's dominated by the opposition party. It's a little fanciful to say you can govern without it. You can't in this country, and he recognizes that. I don't think he did enough to rally public opinion behind him on that, and so on that I think he did make a mistake. But you're right, if you think George Bush may not have been a great fireman, just remember that his opponents are arsonists. So I think he's recognized his mistake. Mr. Clinton was simply going to do it over again, but do it many, many times worse than anything Mr. Bush did. So I think the second term of Mr. Bush will be a lot more fruitful than the first on the tax side. He's learned his lesson.
Panama City, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian.
Hi.
I just wanted to say that one of the few things the Republican Party has going for it that's good is you as a member. And a couple other comments. One is... I think if we ever do get an education president in the White House, it'll be the last time we see any Republican in office. I would also like to say that I think it's a shame that you have to find an Irishman to admit he's a liberal here in the United States. And I just wonder if both gentlemen could possibly comment on, the big, what's his name? Oh, the big absconder of money that's about to be set free here in March.
Mr. Milken?
Brother Milken, right. I wonder if either of your guests could comment on that debacle. Thank you.
Mr. Cockburn.
Well, Milken, is it March? I thought it was some next year, but, well, that is next year, isn't it? Well, Milken, of course, was the symbol of the culture which Mr. Forbes is, I think, perhaps a herald or exponent of the go-go years of the 80s. And just to go back to your previous question, by the way, not liberal, leftist. I like to be described as a leftist, because if you call me a liberal, then once again you're doing that thing of saying, you know, pushing the terms of debate into a way that doesn't really match with reality.
But by the way, to interject, I was attacked one time for referring to someone as a leftist who was a liberal. I mean, what's the difference?
Well, by and large, liberals. I mean, liberalism originally meant in unfettered capitalism, if you want to go back to the 19th century. Now it's a kind of a ragtag word. I mean, the poor old thing limps along with a great big sort of shopping cart full of about 100 different ideas. I don't think liberal means... It has a sort of shorthand notation. But if we go back to something like Teddy Kennedy, and everyone laughed when I said he's a centrist. Actually, if you look objectively at Kennedy's record, and he was the person, from his office came the deregulatory ideas on the airlines of the late 70s. Which, if you go back to the 19th century, is a liberal idea. Liberals have, by and large, in the Democratic Party, have been in favor of military intervention overseas in the post-war period. They're Cold War liberals. So, to equate the word liberal with left is a grievous maltreatment of the word liberal and deludes people about what left ideas are.
One more thing. I remember who attacked. It was, attacked, maybe not fair. He did turn on me in the middle of a program. We were talking about left and right, and it was Father Drinan who said, look, I'm a liberal, I'm not a leftist. A leftist is a communist.
Well, I'd like some things fathered right and said that was a terribly silly remark. But
why?
Because a leftist isn't necessarily a communist. I mean, you can be on the left, let's say on, a liberal might say, that, like, go back to Kennedy. I mean, Kennedy is a big force on the Hill. The Hill, by and large, I think the policies that have come out of the Hill in the last period have been very anti-labor. After a while, if the terms are made to define about 9 different things, and if lefty means communist, and lefty means, I don't know, supporting the policies of Joseph Stalin, obviously the word has ceased to have much utility, except merely as an absolute term of dismissal and abuse. In the same way that the Conservatives or the Republicans have tried to make the word liberal mean a lunatic, as opposed to someone who's basically in the mainstream of U.S. society and basically have provided the ideology of the post-war period.
We'll get to Mr. Forbes in a second. Seattle, Washington, go ahead, please.
Yes, 2 quick comments and 2 quick questions. Mr. Cockburn, are you related to the distinguished British leftist Claude Cockburn? And to Mr. Forbes, do you believe you would be so conservative and free enterprise if you hadn't been born rich, white, with a life on a platter? Now to my questions. Isn't Bush's problem not the Democratic Congress and not his failure to define himself, but the fact that the Republican Party has hollowed out the industrial base of America on purpose in order to drive down the wages of unions, has failed to deal with poverty and misery? And Mr. Cockburn, I would get into greater detail, but Brian will cut me off. But Mr. Cockburn, about Iraq, I see it as manifest destiny redivivus. I think the whole thing, including the initial Desert Storm enterprise, was heavily racist and heavily sort of colonialist. And now I think the attitude of you will obey the Great White Father or you will be punished is absolutely imperialistic. What do you think about that?
Let's start with Mr. Forbes, because he has not been heard from for a while.
Well, as a beneficiary of nepotism, I just would point out in some self-defense that people who've had my kind of upbringing usually are very liberal, not having to start from the bottom. They're very, like they're politicians, they're very adept at spending other people's money, telling other people how to live their lives. I've always had the feeling that one of the fun parts of business is vigorous competition and getting things stirred up. And if you have lower taxes, if you have an open economy, you get the new kind of companies, the Compaqs, the Apples, and others who give IBM fits. That gives us a lot to write about, but it also enhances the standard of living in the country, gets things moving ahead. So in that sense, whatever you want to call me, it's a little different than from most people that I went to school with.
Relationship to the other Cockburn he mentioned?
Oh, Claude Cockburn was who was an immensely distinguished journalist and certainly a leftist, was my father. I've got other ancestors, including Admiral Sir George Cockburn, who burned down the White House in the War of 1812. So we can go all ways.
What about Iraq?
Iraq. Well, was there a racist admixture to the bombing raid on the war against Iraq? I mean, there was a racist element, I think, in the war. Probably, yes, I think there was. And now, as for, it was rather a long question about Iraq. And I can't remember every... in the emotions that were evoked by the war in Iraq, obviously it did arouse a whole skein of rather ugly emotions, including, yes, you know, bomb the darkies and that kind of thing was certainly a part of it.
Now, that's preposterous. Having pride in country, pride in mission is not racist or anything bad like that. Saddam Hussein.
I said it was a part of it. I think there was an element in that reaction that was a part of it. Obviously, pride and the rest of it was also part of it.
Well, there was great joy in defeating Germany, and they were white people. No, Saddam Hussein was a little Hitler, quite a big Hitler, murdered hundreds of thousands of people, was an aggressor, had to be pushed back, should have been done in almost 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, rather than let to be stay in power. That was the mistake. As for the hollowing out of America, the remarkable thing is, despite all of that rhetoric, American manufacturing output as a percent of our economy is the same today as it was 20 years ago, not much different than it was 40 years ago.
Midlothian, Illinois. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
I have a comment to make. During Ronald Reagan's years, we had the greatest expansion of our economy in the post-war World War II era. Now the question arises, how great was that expansion? Who did it help? Because I know my friends and people I see are unemployed. They've had low-paying jobs throughout his whole term. And then it's handed down to George Bush, and George is going around saying, we Republicans have given you jobs, we expanded our economy, and so forth and so forth. And I look around me, and I don't see us doing all that well. And number two, I remember when Ronald Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter, economists coming out saying there will be a great separation of the rich and poor under Ronald Reagan. And I see that. I look around me. There's a vast separation of rich and poor. And number three, that this goes, again, personally in my life. My sister-in-law said to me the other day, we were talking, and she goes, during my whole work history, which she says she started working in 1982 out of college, I have not seen good times. So I'm getting tired of the Republicans saying how great they are and what they've done for our country.
All right, Midlothian.
They've destroyed it.
Yeah, we got the point. Thank you very much. Mr. Forbes?
Well, overall, the American economy did very well during the 1980s. As we mentioned earlier, its growth exceeded that of the entire West German economy. As for the U.S. economy today, there's a lot that can be done, particularly on the tax side, to get it revved up again. But it should be pointed out that in a post-Cold War world, since the Cold War ended a little over a year and a half ago, the United States economy has not done well, but neither has any other countries. Japan is a disaster. Europe is in a deep recession. Britain, Germany, Italy, France, they're all worse off than we are. So it's a post-war readjustment to a new era that is what we're going through now. And if we do things like make it possible for new businesses to be created again, then the economy will move. But one can always find anecdotal evidence, either personal or others, to make a point that everything is great or everything is poor. But if you look at the nation as a whole, we've done better than almost any other industrial country in the last 10 or 12 years, despite all the flaws.
Well, I mean, anecdotal evidence. If you walk around Far Hills, New Jersey, and you'll meet fine fellows like you, and things have looked good. I mean, but the history of the Reagan years was a lot like what the man from Illinois said. It was a good description. If you drive across the country, you'll meet a lot of people, more people, I think, saying that than the other way. The fact of the matter is that the 80s were a pig out for rich people. I mean, and the penalties being paid largely by poor people. There may be overall growth in some areas, but that is the truth of it, and most people know it.
It's an era where we had a great technological boom. Most incomes rose rather than went down. And if you think the 80s were bad, look what you have today. You have real stagnation. The economy hasn't grown. So you can always go back to a period and try to distort it, as people do, to say, gee, it wasn't as good as you thought it was, but it was far better than a recession, and we can have an even better time ahead by getting some of these obstacles out of the way.
Big recession in the 80s, by the way.
I want to ask you about the New York Times front page. The headline is "Fractured GOP Meets as Public Voices Disfavor," and this is a poll that they took. By the way, in general, do you believe polls?
Well, I think it depends on how you frame the question. And that's why body language is so important. When people are asked an opinion and they think they should have an opinion, it may just be still shaping in their minds, not hard, but you look at the poll data and you say, my God, they're 100% for this or 62% for that. It's very misleading. And then one of the problems with our politics today is that we've become hypochondriacs on polls, always taking our pulse, and it can be very misleading.
Okay, well, I'm going to grab this call, and we'll talk more about this poll in a minute. Singer Island, Florida, go ahead, please.
Hi, I have a feeling my question is actually going to provide an answer to the previous caller's question. I'd like Mr. Forbes, in his infinite wisdom, to explain some of the mathematics of the fact that the number of U.S. taxpayers that have reported over $1 million income has increased since the 1980s, from 4,400 people to 64,000 people in 1990. In other words, in 10 years, there's been an increase of 1,350% of reported millionaires. Now, where did the money go?
Is that good or bad?
Is that good, that 64,000 people make over $1 million and more middle class make less money? I think that that's bad, and I think that's where the money and the wealth of the 1980s has gone, and it's been on the backs of the middle class.
All right, thank you.
No, actually, the new number of millionaires is a good thing. It means new businesses are being created. The middle class expanded as well during the 1980s, even though people feel bad about it today, primarily because of the recession. that's irrefutable. And if you want an environment that is stagnates, then you don't get much economic growth. If people, one of the things, Brian, that came out, great distortion a few months ago, was that the top 1% got 60% of the gains in income. If you looked at those numbers very carefully, most of those gains came between 1977 and 1981 under Jimmy Carter. The percent went down under Ronald Reagan, but they used the years 77 through 89 or 90 as if it was the whole Reagan era. That kind of intellectual distortion goes on all the time.
I love it. You'll end up proving that the rich got poorer under the Reagan
But you're trying to prove a prosperous era wasn't, and it was. It was a good era.
For a lot of people, I don't know, Steve, I don't know if you figure it out too much. A lot of people really don't feel they did too well in the last 10 years. And I mean, your deadly rival, Business Week, did a pretty good...
And that's why 1988, Mr. Bush won by a landslide.
Forbes is devoted to trumpeting your free enterprise, and I mean, your function in life is to trumpet the entrepreneurial this and that and the other thing. But there is a world outside that the pool of your excellent readers, and a lot of people there feel that the society, quite rightly, dealt a fairly unbalanced deal in the so-called years of prosperity, that it did create a tremendous number of millionaires. A lot of the money that was churned around went into extremely unproductive uses, as the career and rather unfortunate demise of Mr. Milken's operations in the 80s indicated. It was unproductive investment. And with the debate somehow in this, even in this program, as I noticed, it's sort of gone towards, I was sitting here thinking about it, it's gone towards, you know, removing taxes. What the debate should, if you're really going to talk about the 90s, are you really talking about a government with the will to really deal with a post-Cold War period? I live in California, where millions of jobs have been lost as aerospace firms closed down. Now, Bush, I don't think, has got an idea in his head about what to do about that, and I don't think Clinton's got much of an idea either. I mean, you have to have a proper plan. You have to have public investment. It's simply not enough to say...
There you hit the word, plan.
Terrible word, plan. What's wrong with the plan?
Bureaucrats in Washington will know better how to spend your money, invest your money, than you do yourself. It hasn't worked in Europe.
You have a business plan. You have a business plan, right?
We have a business plan ourselves.
You don't think the country should have a plan?
Not like what you want. It didn't work in the Soviet Union. How do you know what my plan is? You never
asked me. You never asked what the plan was.
Well, I've read your writings, and I have a good flavor, other than the flat tax, that it probably wouldn't be very good. But it hasn't worked. It's unraveling in Japan. It's got Germany in a fix, and it didn't work in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
La Quinta, California, you're next.
Yes, I'm very worried for Mr. Bush. I just wonder whether, do you think his family and Mr. Bush and the bankers and Congress have enough money yet where they can do something for the American people?
Have they got enough money? I mean, is there enough money available to do overall? Or has Mr. Bush got...
He's off the line. I'm not sure...
I think Mr. Bush, personally, I don't think he's going to be joining the breadline, so I think we needn't worry about that. But I think, is there money to launch a recovery? Yeah, there is money. It's a question of... That's the little debate Mr. Forbes and I were having, how you allocate society's resources.
Here's the Washington Post magazine from Sunday, and they have the leadership thing on the cover. What about this vision thing, the leadership thing? Is that... It's always being written about. Is there something missing?
Well, people like to believe their leaders have some sense of direction, even if they make tactical changes along the way, that they're going to some goal. And Mr. Reagan had that, and Mr. Bush is accused of not having that. I think he has more than he's given credit for, but since he's not a great communicator, very poor communicator, and pays too much attention to some of his advisors, he gets whipsawed and ends up looking worse than he really is.
Let's take this call from Atwater, Florida, as we look at this artwork from the Washington Post. Go ahead, please. Hello, Atwater, Florida. You're on the air.
Hello.
Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yes, I appreciate C-SPAN.
Thank you.
What I want to know is why nobody's talking about how the legal system or the Attorney General of the Republican Party wants to cover up everything. It happened in the Reagan years.
Can you give us a specific?
Well, the Iraqgate, he won't let them have a special prosecutor. And they suppress so much information. I think that the Republican Party is not a party of truth anymore. I think it's a party of lies.
Thanks. If
you're going to have a special prosecutor law, I'd like it to apply to the legislative branch, not just the executive branch. And two, that the special prosecutor live by the same kind of rules and budgets that other prosecutors do, and stop some of the abuses that we've seen in the case of our publisher, Cap Weinberger. So I have a special interest on that. But if you're going to have that kind of office, then let it apply to all branches of government, not just one where it's used for political purposes, as we see many times in the past.
You know, when we were at the Democratic Convention, the nation was everywhere. You could pick it up on street corners. I mean, it was literally available everywhere, and you can't find it here. Is it going to be here, the magazine?
Oh, yeah, there's lots of copies. I think it was stopped. So there's very heavy security this morning. I think the little steel staples on the back wouldn't make it through the X-ray thing, so they had to keep it up. But it'll be here later in the day.
Do you expect it to have the same, you know, acceptance here as it did in New York?
I think exciting ideas, vividly put in punchy prose, will always find a ready audience, Brian.
If the nation stuck to a flat tax, as Mr. Cockburn advocates, then a lot of people would read it.
I notice you slid away from the poll question pretty fast. Journalists don't like to talk about polls too often.
Coming back to the poll, but here is in Forbes magazine, you see this every week, the publisher, Cap Weinberger, has a commentary. And we'll go to Reston, Virginia next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Brian.
Good morning.
Thank you for C-SPAN. You do a wonderful job.
Thank you, sir.
I wanted to thank Mr. Cockburn for all the wonderful work he's done over the years. I've been reading him in The Nation, and thank goodness we have men like Mr. Cockburn, and I really enjoy watching you this morning, especially sitting there next to Mr. Forbes. One comment. I wanted to know how you felt about some of the things that Christopher Hitchens has said about the president. Some of them, I agree with them, but he said them in ways that are a little bit strong. I don't know how close a colleague he is of yours writing with The Nation, but do you agree with many of the things he says about Mr. Bush?
Well, no, in Christopher's writing, he's probably very vividly abusive of Mr. Bush. I by and large, he's attacked me savagely for certain things, by the way, so we're not...
Chris Hitchens has?
We're not joined at the hip. I think he would regard me as more left than him, but...
He's British, though.
He's a Brit.
And you're Irish.
And I'm Irish. Maybe there's some kind of ancestral thing going on there. I'd like to come back to one thing. We're holding up the picture of Bush and, you know, the savage cartoon. I mean, it's not so long since everyone was saying Bush was masterful and he'd won the war in Iraq. And the press, a lot of journalism, a lot of the press is saying what everybody else is saying and saying because they can't think of anything particularly new to say, and they all hop on the wire like the blackbirds on the telephone wires. Most of journalism is inane repetition of some other silly thing, and one just has to accept that.
Both of you, what gets the most attention for what you write? When do you find the meter going up, the mail coming in, the calls coming in, the outrage?
Well, in the old days, it would be if you wrote about gold, if you wrote about guns, you wrote about airbags for some reason, you got a ton of letters. The column I did recently that got an avalanche of letters was when I said the world is overpopulated, period, not. That people in a free environment are a resource, not a drain on the earth. I got tons of letters from the Al Gores of the world saying the world is coming to an end. It's sort of the old apocalyptic vision that preachers used to do, now environmentalists do, and so I see people as an asset, but you should see the abusive letters that I got on that one.
What gets people moving the most? But you're right, Mr. Cockburn.
Recently, I suppose the one that outraged a lot of nation people a lot was I came out and said I thought the Warren Commission was right. That got people really mad. Then I said I thought Havel was Václav Havel was way overestimated as a politician. He was like I mean, of course, journalists loved it because he used to be a writer, and artists loved him because he's an artist. But I mean, I thought he was a very incompetent president who did some very bad things. That got people crazy. By and large, in America, if you write about relations between Israel, that gets people very upset. There's lots of things that get people crazy.
Sierra Vista, Arizona. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I would kind of like to talk about the politics of envy. What hope is there for somebody if we say you can't be a millionaire, you can't make more money than the man next door? We saw that in Russia, and look at the line, and look at the sad faces. Seems to me the liberals have doom and gloom, and they can't even laugh. I mean, good heavens, we never made more than $20,000, except one year we made 30, and then the government said we were poverty level. I mean, come on. Let everybody have a chance in life. not be held down because somebody else doesn't have as much as you do, because the government doesn't take away from the wealthy and give to these people. They take away from the hard-working person and give to these people.
Thank you, Sierra Vista. Mr.
I'm
Coburn.
sitting next to a millionaire, and I'm laughing, and I'm not consumed with envy for Mr.
How do you
Forbes.
know he's a millionaire?
Are you?
Not when I fill out my tax form.
Well, that's a very...
No.
I mean,
And
yesterday,
in
we had an interesting march yesterday. I was observing a march here in Houston, and it began in a very poor quarter of Houston, in the 4th Ward, which is the old freed town where the freed slaves went, which is a really, described as a slum. It didn't look like a slum to me, and everyone looked very cheery. And you know, people were sitting out on the porches and looking around. And you could say the houses were pretty ramshackle, and I gather it's all owned by an insurance company, the whole block, and they want to smash the thing flat and build a lot of yuppie, condos. Then we marched along the road, and we went through a sort of middle-income area, and we ended up in River Oaks, in an area of tremendous prosperity. And it was an area incredibly gloomy. You couldn't see anybody. The lawns were all shaven, and there were these majestic houses, and occasionally someone would rather nervously poke their nose out. And it was an area where it seemed to me tremendous melancholy prevailed. I suppose they're all worrying whether money's going to be taken away by Bill Clinton or something.
The caller touched on something that gets lost in the shuffle, and that is assets in a business. That's not really necessarily cash in hand, cash in the bank, a pile of gold. And the value of a business can go up or down depending on people who are buying your good or your service. And that kind of, in the U.S., you have an enormous change of people who have a lot of assets one day, very little the next. In our business, the money goes back into growing the business again. So millionaire on paper, yes, but in terms of spending cash, definitely not.
By the way, I saw a figure that might be of interest to our audience. The Republican Party put out this figure here that there are 750 television cameras covering this convention. How does that make you feel?
All of them in the end owned by millionaires, probably.
Sparta.
That's the trouble. Too many millionaires own the press, too.
Sparta, New Jersey. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
I have to say, your program, I couldn't recommend it. It's the best thing's ever happened to the country, as far as I'm concerned.
Thanks for watching.
I have to comment to Mr. Forbes, and I'll make a few statements, and I'd like his response. He indicated how during the Reagan years, the country boomed. And I look at it now, we're getting the bill. We have a national debt, which Reagan was supposedly going to lower. Forget it, in orbit. We have 30 to 40 million people with no health insurance coverage. We have small firms and large firms, many which were not represented by union, going to foreign countries in search of labor to exploit, no environmental concerns, and then ship the product back here. People lost their jobs. We have a former president going to Japan and receiving $2 million for a speech, which I'd like to know the content of. I guess I'd like his response to that.
Thanks. Mr. Forbes?
Well, as for the national debt as a proportion of our economy, it's lower today, no worse today than it was 20 years ago, and about a third of what it was after World War II. Now that the Cold War is over, I think you'll start to see an era where the national debt as a proportion of the economy goes down. By the end of the 1980s, if you take state and local and federal governments, overall they were in balance. As for job investment, you had during the 1980s a boom in this country, money pouring in, investing in this economy, the opposite of what happened in the 50s and 60s when we financed the growth of others. Others were financing our growth. And instead of building on that base, we allowed Congress to raise taxes. We went on a regulatory binge. We put obstacles in the place of the entrepreneur, and suddenly the economy stops growing. We should go back to what works, which is letting people do business with one another.
I keep threatening to read this thing on the New York Times front page. I better do it before the program's going to be over. The question is, and this is a poll, do you think there needs to be real change in the way things are going on in this country, or would you be satisfied if things go on pretty much the way they are now? Do either one of you have any idea what the percentage of people that think there ought to be change?
I think it would probably be 70 or 80%.
It's 92%. Is that a fair question?
it's a fair question, and I think that what we are seeing now is that we're on the verge of a new, what you might call, progressive era, where we're going to see a lot of reform in education, health care, the legal system, and the way we do environment. It's going to be a very fruitful and productive period like it was at the turn of the century and like it was in the 1930s.
The second question, by the way, is do you think that George Bush would bring about this change? And 81% say things would stay the same, and 15% say Mr. Bush would change things.
Yeah, well, to go back to these polls, I mean, it's like, should Brian Lamb be Secretary of State? And they all say yes. Given Brian Lamb's experience of diplomacy, should he be Secretary of State? And they all say no. So, I mean, these questions are always asked in the context of, you know, media reporting of a certain way. Yes, of course people are for change. Do you think the country should remain stuck in the mud, or should it move forward? I mean, the wording of these polling questions is so often self-fulfilling that it's ridiculous, and we are shackled to this polling. There's a sort of iron triangle between the pollsters, the campaign managers, and the campaign reporters. They all talk to each other on the telephone all the time. They barely can find their way out of their offices. It's like George Bush, who went to an exhibition in a retail show, and he'd never seen the automatic electronic checkout, you know, which is the experience of most Americans. He hadn't seen it. It had been in usage for 10 years. He had never seen... He had never had to drag a packet of goods across the electronic checkout in a store. I mean, this is the experience of most people. I mean, that single statement, that it was amazing surprise to George that they had this cunning way that the price of the can of tomatoes or whatever it is would flash up on your checkout register. He thought that was astounding. My God, he said. Now, to most Americans, they would say, here is the most compelling evidence that the guy never goes outside. And I think it's true of most journalists, most pollsters, and most of the people who are run this very tight, what you could call an election industry. And here in the Astrodome, and this immense security, you've got this bubble called the election industry, a lot of which has very little relevance to the way people actually look at things.
And that's part of the problem. Mr. Perot was that he hired a lot of people who supposedly knew about politics. If you're going to wage that kind of war, you build your own army with your own officer corps and don't rely on the professionals who will tell you how to fight the last one.
Rockville, Maryland. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Mr. Forbes, I'm sorry to hear that you can distort facts just like a Republican can. The only reason why Republicans won elections after election, especially in the White House, because there isn't a fact that they can't distort, just like you're sitting up there distorting about the in terms of our deficit to post-war, it's no lower than, I don't know what the heck they're distorting now. But I remember when Ronald Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter, he says, three things that he said is that I'm going to cut your taxes, I'm going to lower the deficit, and I'm going to increase military spending because to close up our window of vulnerability. I was in high school then. I have a very conservative English teacher. I wrote a paper explaining to him that this couldn't be done. This is a dream. This couldn't be done. Now, him being very conservative argued with me over and over again, but he did give me straight A's in my English class. I've never gotten straight A's in anything in my life. But, you know, so that's just to show me that the only way I feel George Bush have a good chance of winning again, because he'll have people like you that show him how to distort the facts, how to give American people a dream again, and then we're going to end up with the same old thing.
Thanks, Rockville. Mr. Forbes.
Well, anytime you don't like what you hear, it's a natural reaction to say it's a distortion. The fact is we did have a military buildup. It played a key part in bringing down the Soviet Union. We did have tax reductions, especially in income tax rates. Not enough, but we should do more, not less, which is what Mr. Clinton wants to do. He wants to start raising them again. And as for the government debt, it went up during this unprecedented peacetime military buildup, but by the end of Mr. Reagan's term, government finance in this country was balanced.
Running out of time for our two guests this morning. It's too bad we don't have... We could do this all day, couldn't we? Las Vegas, go ahead, please.
Good morning, Brian. I wish you would do it all day.
I agree. This is what it's all about, when you have people that disagree, and they disagree in not a disagreeable way. Go ahead.
I have a comment and then a question. First, my comment is that... for Mr. Forbes, a lot of what you said this morning is factually wrong. We're losing a lot of manufacturing jobs in this country, and wages in real terms have been flat or have gone down slightly since 1973.
I just want to make a point that I didn't say manufacturing jobs. Like in the farming sector, the number of farmers has been going down for 80 years. Number of manufacturing jobs has been on a decline. I said manufacturing output and productivity had a great run, which made us more competitive. In every country, industrial country, number of manufacturing jobs is on a downward trend.
Las Vegas, continue, please. You still there?
I'd like to have the views of both people about the NAFTA Free Trade Pact.
Thanks.
I'll hang up and listen.
Thanks a lot for calling. Mr. Cockburn, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
I think in principle free trade's a good idea. I think if it means, let's say, the trade between Mexico and the United States, if it means an absolute lowering of workplace standards, a lowering of environmental regulations to the lowest level, then it's a bad thing. I think you cannot say in the world today there should be one island of prosperous high-wage jobs and the rest of the world should be sweeping the driveway. I don't think that's right. But I think if free trade is used as a whipsaw, as I think Labour quite rightly says it is, to launch a savage attack on the standards of people here, to export manufacturing jobs away constantly, and then go. I come from Ireland, where, you know, a plant might come from, in fact, the economy of my local town is maintained by offshore firms. But they constantly say, in my hometown, they say, if you don't have no taxes for us, if you don't let us repatriate all profits, we're going to go to Manila. And if Manila doesn't do that, we're going to go to the People's Republic of China. So you constantly get, in the end, what you get is slave labor, because that's the cheapest labor of all.
That's preposterous. When you have free trade in an open global environment, wages go up everywhere. Mexico, which has been opening up its economy, has had a growth for the first time in 10 or 12 years. And if you have free trade, we're going to have huge markets for the United States. In the last 4.5 years, our exports have tripled from 12 billion to over 33 billion. So we'll both come out ahead if we reduce the barriers between us. And history shows that time and time again. It's the best way to get things growing is to expand people's opportunities everywhere.
President of Mexico here on the cover of the August 17th Forbes. 2 calls left. Woburn, Massachusetts. Go ahead, please.
Oh, good morning.
Hi.
Hi. I'd like to first thank both your guests for coming in this morning. I really do appreciate it. You guys are helping towards, I think, a new wave of the way television is going to be. And thank you very much for doing it, Brian.
Glad to be here, I can tell you that. Go ahead.
Okay. I'd like to support many of the things Mr. Cockburn is saying. I think he is a little more liberal than some people in the country. But specifically, I would like to ask Mr. Forbes. Earlier in the first program, you said that generally people's incomes have gone up during the 80s and the beginning the 90s. But why today is to take usually 2 incomes in order to run a household, and things such as the ratio required of your income to buy a house has doubled in the last 20 years. People's insurance rates and the amount of their income that they have to pay for insurance has gone up. Taxes have gone up in the last 20 years in that same way. And that the way that you view what should I say, the average income is much too structured, much too old. People need a much higher portion of their income back into their pocket.
Woburn, we're going to have to let you go because we are running out of time. Mr. Forbes.
I think it's a good argument for further tax reductions. When you had 2-income households, people got kicked up into higher tax brackets. And so more needs to be done in that area less. Comment on housing. There was more housing, especially for single people or people who weren't related to one another, living together during the 1980s. But a key component on rising house prices up until this recession was regulation, making it very difficult to build those developments that our parents had and grandparents had in the late 40s and 1950s. So when you have that kind of regulation, you pay more. It's up to 40% of a house price is pure regulation.
Mr. Cockburn, hold your thoughts so we can take a last call and you can get it in. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, you're next.
Yes, I'm thrilled to be on the show this morning, Brian. I think this is the best network show there is.
Thank you.
I'd like to put the question to these 2 gentlemen regarding abortion, because it is a political issue and we can't get rid of it. Should Governor Clinton be asked the question of defining woman when he advocates woman's right of choice? By the statutes, by the statistics, rather, of the choice advocates, a very high percentage of unplanned pregnancies occurs in juveniles, or what we normally call juveniles. Because of the reaction to the restrictions in the Pennsylvania abortion law, I would have to conclude that the choice advocates would define woman as any female human being old enough to conceive a child.
All right, sir, I'm going to have to let you go because we only have about 60 seconds. Mr. Cockburn?
Well, just in brief answer to the last one, I believe, I don't think I'd necessarily endorse the idea. Clinton, in fact, in Arkansas was put through a bill which demanded parental consent, as far as I can remember. I mean, I'd like to say generally, a lot of the questions are describing an America that Mr. Forbes seems to be denying, that they're talking about the reality of you need 2 incomes in a family, you're talking about the reality of having to devote more money to housing, they're talking about the reality of real wages slipping down. And there is a real disjuncture, I think, between the way a lot of the people here, Republicans, assembled in Houston, actually see the world after 12 years of Reagan-Bush and the way the world really is.
30 seconds, sir.
And I think that what people are reacting to is the recession of the last 3 years, that we started to get the economy going here and elsewhere in the 1980s. And if we build on those principles of allowing people to keep more of what they earn, having better opportunities to start businesses, easier to get loans, we'll have much more prosperity. And the gloom and doom we hear today, people will go like the morning mist if we clear away these obstacles. The American economy is very strong fundamentally. Get those obstacles out of the way and we have a boom.
Our 2 guests have been Malcolm S. Forbes, Steve Forbes, that's a junior at the end of the name, editor-in-chief of Forbes magazine and CEO and president of Forbes, Inc. from Far Hills, New Jersey, and Alexander Cockburn, columnist of The Nation, also syndicated columnist with the Los Angeles Times. He is an Irish citizen but lives in Northern California. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us in this early hour here in Houston.
Thank you, Brian.
We have the mayor of Houston coming up, Bob Lanier, in just a few moments. But first, we're going to listen to KTRH AM radio here in Houston for the news and take a look at the dome, the Houston Astrodome outside.
It will never make better sense to buy or lease a new LS400 from Westside Lexus than now. The good news is that we have even better values available on demos and repaired hail-damaged new cars, and a staff of Westside Lexus professionals who will treat you to your best car buying experience ever. The bad news is that we're in the final days of our 1992 model year with a limited availability of product. We're Westside Lexus on I-10 between Kirkwood and Derry Ashford, where deals are final but relationships continue.
KTRH News Time, 8:29. Time for traffic and weather together. Joining us, first of all, meteorologist Joe Sobel for our tour of Texas. What kind of weather ahead for the state, Joe?
Well, in East Texas, Lana, the weather about as good as it ever gets at this time of year, with a good deal of sunshine and low humidity, and temperatures up around or a little bit above 90 should not be too hard to tolerate this afternoon, and that includes here in the backyard and up into the Golden Triangle as well. Hey, get out to West Texas. There have been a few showers and thunderstorms out in the Panhandle, and an upper air disturbance coming southward out of southern Colorado will cause that kind of thing to happen out on occasion from the Big Bend to the Panhandle and then on westward. Folks who may have come here from out of town for the convention, perhaps from Southern California, enjoy yourself here on the sunny, dry Gulf Coast. Because out in La La Land today, it'll be about 95 degrees in Los Angeles, and in beautiful downtown Burbank, about 105.
Na-na-na-na-na.
So come on down. Anyway, our forecast for Houston and vicinity is for a good deal of sunshine today, and the temperature this afternoon getting up to about 90, but with relatively low humidity. Fair tonight, low 66 to 70. Tomorrow and on into Wednesday, the humidity comes back. Along with that comes a chance for a shower thunderstorm tomorrow afternoon or on Wednesday, and high temperatures those days, a little muggier and up into the 90-degree range.
Yeah. How about in the tropics, Joe?
Sounds like an old 60s doo-wop song.
Yes.
We're watching a fairly strong tropical wave. Actually, it's a tropical depression now. It does have some closed circulation about 2,500 miles to the east-southeast of Miami. Now, that puts it way, way out there, but it's got some potential. Conditions closer to the Caribbean islands, which would be a few days down the road, are more favorable for development than they've been recently. And I guess I wouldn't be surprised if we have Andrew to talk about at some point later on this week. Obviously, again, 2,500 miles east-southeast of Miami, it is of no concern to us.
You were thinking of Shanana.
Ah!
Yeah, I didn't say sha-na-na-na-na-na. A little different there. How about across the Houston area right now, Joe?
Well, bump. It's 73 degrees in Galveston, 69 at Hobby, and 62 at Intercontinental. People may think we've changed format.
No.
And it's 70 downtown. We're looking at a high today near 90.
Thanks, Joe.
You're welcome.
And Ramalama Ding Dong, by the way. Just wanted to
I hear
throw
you
that
too.
one. KTRH News Time, 8:32.
And we're checking with Stuart Russell now. He's found an accident on Highway 290.
This one is on the inbound side of Highway 290 at 34th in the left lane. Traffic is backed up towards Antoine to get through. Over on the Katy Freeway, still have slow traffic trying to get in past Derry Ashford to Kirkwood, and then slow from the tollway to Campbell. An earlier accident on that freeway is long gone now. And a demonstration on Schumacher at Chimney Rock north of 59. It could cause you some delay, so avoid Chimney Rock. Use Fountain View or South Rice as alternates. I'm Stuart Russell with an AM 740 KTRH traffic update.
It's Monday and time for lunch at the Men's Club of Houston. Today and every Monday, enjoy their filet and atomic shrimp special, only $6.95. The Men's Club, the best business climate in town, 3303 Sage.
AM 740 KTRH, your first choice for traffic updates.
I can't afford to be late. AM 740 has more traffic and weather updates than any other station. KTRH saves me time.
Hear it first on Houston's only news radio, AM 740 KTRH.
This is the news station, AM 740 KTRH.
Where the News Watch never stops, I'm J.P. Pritchard.
And I'm Lana Hughes. KTRH News Time, 8:33. It's Monday, August 17th, and here's what's going on in your world this morning. Campaign 92, KTRH continuing coverage of the Republican National Convention.
The official opening of the convention is just hours away now. Earlier this year, it looked like the Houston gathering would be nothing less than a coronation ceremony for George Bush. Instead, the president's going to have to use the convention to try to take away Bill Clinton's title as the comeback kid.
And News Radio's Daryl Azar is at the KTRH broadcast booth at the Astrodome and reports today will be a day of old wounds and old heroes.
The acrimony of the abortion battle is like an open sore on the body of the Grand Old Party, and before this morning's session ends, a full-scale abortion war could erupt. After Christian fundamentalists won a big battle on the platform committee last week, protecting strict anti-abortion language. But now there are mixed signals from the First Family. Republicans for Choice, or rather Republicans for Responsible Decision spokeswoman Babette Hale of Houston thinks that the First Family is sending them a signal.
We might be able to persuade the people who are running the convention to allow delegates to vote on the issue of abortion.
Pro-choice Republicans claim they are close to forcing an abortion debate. But whatever happens with abortion, the party is counting on the great communicator to heal the wounds and restore party harmony. Former President Ronald Reagan is...
KTRH All News AM radio here in Houston. You're looking at a live picture of the Astrodome.